Imagine being 93. Your hands shake, your legs ache, but every morning you still climb into the same old Buick and drive somewhere no one asked you to go. And one day, blue lights flash behind you. Not for anything terrible, just a ticket. You were speeding, sir. The courtroom was half full that morning. Judge Caprio adjusted his glasses, glancing at the docket. Robert Hayes, he read, 93 years old, charged with exceeding the limit on Elm Street. He looked up. A frail man stood before him, straight-backed, wearing a faded army jacket zipped to the neck. His shoes were polished, though cracked at the sides. "Mr. Hayes," Caprio began, "do you understand why you received this ticket?" The old man nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. I can't deny it. But if I may, I'd like to explain." The judge's tone softened. "Please." Robert took a breath that trembled, but didn't break. "I was speeding because I was late for the hospital. Not for me, for my boy. He had a stroke a few months ago. Can't speak much now, barely remembers his name. But when I sit by his bed and talk, he tries to repeat my words. Says hearing my voice helps him find himself again." The courtroom went silent. Even the hum of the old ceiling fan felt louder. Judge Caprio leaned forward. "How old is your son?" 67, Robert said. "He served in the Marines, Vietnam. Came home, but not whole. His war never ended, just moved into his head." "You served too?" the judge asked quietly. "Yes, sir. Korea, 1951. Different war, same noise. You learn not to flinch, but you never stop hearing." He smiled faintly, as if at a private memory. "When I got that ticket, officer said I should slow down. And I thought, if he only knew who I was trying to reach before time ran out." The judge rested his pen, watching him. "Why drive yourself, Mr. Hayes? No one could take you?" "My wife would have," the man said softly. "But she passed last year. I promised her I'd look after our boy. So, I drive. I drive every morning, even when my knees don't want to. Because when I walk into that room, he knows his old man kept his word." Caprio nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting something beyond the case. "You realize, Mr. Hayes, we're here over a small infraction, but I suspect there's nothing small about the story behind it." Robert smiled faintly. "Your Honor, when you reach my age, life's made of small things. The smell of coffee, the sound of your son saying one word right. Sometimes you push the pedal a little harder, not because you're reckless, but because you're afraid time's moving faster than you are." For a moment, no one spoke. A woman in the back row wiped her eyes. The judge folded his hands. "Mr. Hayes," he said finally, "I've presided over thousands of cases. Parking tickets, speeding fines, worse. But I can't recall one that started so ordinary and turned into something so human." Robert gave a tired grin. "Sir, I didn't come here for pity. I came because the law said I must. But the truth is, when you've buried friends in uniform and outlived the woman who loved you, a ticket isn't much. It's just another piece of paper between you and the end of the day." The judge's voice softened to nearly a whisper. "Let's do this. I'll hear the rest of your story tomorrow before I make my decision. Something tells me the law isn't the only thing we should be listening to here." Robert straightened his back, a soldier's reflex. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll be here, unless the Lord or the highway has other plans." He turned to leave, steady but slow. The courtroom watched him go, and for the first time that morning, no one looked bored or distracted. Even the officer who wrote the ticket lowered his head slightly, as if saluting. Judge Caprio watched the old man disappear through the doors, then murmured under his breath, "Sometimes justice isn't about guilt or innocence. Sometimes it's about remembering why people still try." The next morning, the courtroom felt different. The usual shuffle of papers and low chatter faded when Robert Hayes entered. The kind of quiet that follows respect, not pity. He wore the same jacket, the one with the small American flag pin on the collar, pressed and neat. Judge Caprio greeted him gently. "Good to see you again, Mr. Hayes. How's your son today?" Robert's voice was low but clear. "He's hanging on, Your Honor. Some days he opens his eyes when I start talking. Yesterday, he said half a word before drifting off again. That's progress in our world." The judge nodded. "You said yesterday you served in Korea. What year was that?" 1950 to 53, Robert replied. "I was just a kid then, 19, and thought I was 10 feet tall. By the end of the first winter, I'd seen enough snow and silence to last 10 lifetimes." He gave a small laugh. "The funny thing about war, Judge, it doesn't end when they tell you to go home. It just follows you back, changes uniforms." Caprio leaned back slightly, listening. "And yet, you built a life afterward." "Yes, sir. Came home, met my wife Margaret at a diner in Pawtucket. She had the kind of smile that could stop a man mid-sentence. We built a home near the shore. She planted daisies, said they reminded her of peace. I worked 40 years at the shipyard, raised our boy. He grew up wanting to be like his old man." The judge smiled faintly. "That sounds like something to be proud of." Robert hesitated. "It used to, until I realized he copied the wrong things." The courtroom stilled again. "He joined the Marines because of me," Robert said. "Said he wanted to finish what I started. I told him war wasn't something you finish, but he went anyway. When he came back, he didn't talk for months. He'd just sit on the porch, staring at the ocean. Some nights, he'd scream himself awake." Caprio's eyes softened. "Did you talk about it?" "I tried, but I'd spent a lifetime teaching him to be strong, to stand tall, don't cry, don't complain. I didn't know that kind of strength could break a man. I should have told him it's okay to fall apart sometimes." The old man's hand trembled slightly as he spoke. "Maybe that's my real ticket, Judge. Not the one in your file, but the one I earned by not listening soon enough." The judge took a slow breath. "You're being too hard on yourself, Mr. Hayes. Fathers teach what they know. You taught him to survive." Robert smiled sadly. "Maybe. But surviving ain't the same as living. My wife understood that. She used to say, 'Rob, you can't keep fighting ghosts.' When she passed last spring, I promised her I'd take care of our boy. I just didn't realize that promise would be the hardest battle of all." A long silence hung in the air before the judge spoke again. "You've carried a lot on your shoulders, Mr. Hayes, more than most could." Robert chuckled softly. "That's the thing about old soldiers, Judge. We don't notice the weight until we set it down. Then it's too heavy to lift again." Caprio glanced at the file, then closed it. "Yesterday, I thought this was about a speeding ticket. But now I see it's about something else entirely. About a man trying to keep his word to the people he loves." Robert straightened his back, the soldier's habit returning. "I've failed at plenty, Your Honor, but I don't plan to fail at that." Caprio looked at him for a long moment. "If your wife were here today, what do you think she'd say?" Robert smiled, a tired, wistful smile. "She'd say I drive too fast, talk too slow, and care too much. And then she'd hold my hand and remind me that keeping your word is the one promise worth breaking the rules for." The judge nodded slowly. "I see why you broke the limit, Mr. Hayes. You weren't running from the law. You were racing time. The courtroom was silent except for the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Caprio finally said, "We'll continue tomorrow. I want to hear more before making a decision." Robert nodded once, then turned to leave. His steps were slow but steady, the kind of stride that carries decades of duty and loss in equal measure. As he reached the door, Caprio's voice stopped him. "Mr. Hayes, your story isn't over yet." Robert looked back, a faint glimmer of humor in his eyes. "At my age, Judge, every day's a sequel." And then he was gone, leaving the room quieter than before, but somehow fuller. The courtroom was quieter than usual that morning. A soft drizzle streaked the tall windows, turning the city outside into a blur of gray and gold. Judge Caprio looked up as Robert Hayes entered, his cap tucked neatly under one arm. The old man walked a little slower this time, but still stood tall, the kind of posture that comes from discipline, not pride. "Mr. Hayes," the judge greeted, "before we continue, there's an officer here today who handled your ticket. I'd like to hear his side as well." A young patrolman stepped forward, clearly nervous. "Yes, Your Honor. I remember Mr. Hayes. He wasn't reckless, not like some drivers. He was careful, just fast. When I pulled him over, he kept apologizing, said his son needed him. I thought he was making an excuse." Robert turned slightly toward him. "You did your job, son. Don't apologize for that." The officer nodded, his voice tightening. "Still, I wish I'd known then. I might have just waved him on." Caprio folded his hands. "And that right there, officer, is why we listen before we judge." A faint murmur rippled through the small crowd. The judge looked back at Robert. "How is your son today?" Robert hesitated. "He's weaker. Doctors say his body's fighting, but the mind's tired. Yesterday, he looked at me like he didn't know who I was, then whispered my name anyway. That's all I needed." The judge's expression softened. "You go every day?" "Every single one," Robert said. "It's not duty, Judge. It's a promise. When a man makes a promise to those he loves, it doesn't expire when things get hard." There was something in his tone, not pride, not sorrow, but the quiet certainty of someone who's seen too much to lie, even to himself. Caprio leaned forward. "Do you have anyone helping you?" "No one left, Your Honor. Just neighbors who wave when I drive by. They don't know where I go, and I don't tell them. Some roads you travel alone." The room fell silent again. The judge glanced toward the officer. "Did you notice anything else when you stopped him?" The young man nodded. "Yes, sir. There was a photo on the passenger seat. A younger man in uniform, standing beside him. Looked proud, like they'd just come home." Robert spoke quietly. "That was the day my boy shipped out. His mother cried. I told her not to worry, that he'd come back better than me. He swallowed hard. He did come back, Judge. Just not all the way." Caprio sat back, his voice softer now. "You've carried 2 wars in one lifetime. One fought overseas, one fought in your own home." Robert gave a faint smile. "And I'll keep fighting the second one until I can't drive anymore. I'm not afraid of death, Judge. I'm afraid of not showing up." A long pause. Then the judge asked quietly, "What drives a man your age to still fight like that?" Robert's answer came after a moment. "Because love's the only war worth losing everything for." The courtroom seemed to exhale all at once. Even the officer lowered his eyes. Judge Caprio looked down at the file before closing it gently. "Mr. Hayes, I've spent my life reading laws and rules, but stories like yours remind me that law doesn't always see the heart beating underneath." Robert nodded. That's because the law has to stay steady. People like me, we're allowed to shake a little. Caprio smiled faintly at that. Fair enough. Then his tone changed. Firm, deliberate. Tomorrow, I'll deliver my decision. But before I do, I'd like you to bring that photo. I think the court should see what you were racing toward. Robert hesitated, then nodded. It's old, Your Honor. Edges worn. But it's the only thing that still rides shotgun with me. The judge nodded back. Bring it. I have a feeling it belongs in this courtroom as much as any piece of evidence. Robert gathered his cap and turned toward the exit. As he reached the door, Caprio called softly, Mr. Hayes, if every man loved like you drive, the world would be safer. The old soldier smiled over his shoulder. Maybe, Judge, but the road to love doesn't come with a speed limit. And with that, he left, the faint sound of rain following him out, as if the world itself paused to listen to the rhythm of his steps. The next morning, the courthouse was packed. Word had spread. The 93-year-old veteran speeding for love had reached local news. Reporters waited outside, but inside, Judge Caprio had banned cameras. This, he'd said firmly, isn't a story. It's a man's life. When Robert Hayes entered, the entire room stood. He seemed surprised by the attention, almost embarrassed by it. His coat was buttoned wrong, his hands trembled slightly, but his eyes, steady as ever. Mr. Hayes, the judge began, you brought the photograph? Robert nodded and placed a worn picture on the desk. Two men stood side by side, father and son, both in uniform, both smiling in that restrained, soldierly way that hides everything words can't. The edges were yellowed, folded a dozen times. The judge looked at it quietly. When was this taken? June 1972, Robert said. He was 22, about to deploy. His mother took that photo on the porch. I told her it was a proud day. She said it was the worst day of her life. The room stayed silent. Even the clerks had stopped typing. Caprio's voice softened. And now you drive to that hospital every morning. Robert nodded. Yes, sir. I tell him the same thing I told his mother back then. Everything's going to be fine. I used to believe it. Now, I just hope he hears it. The judge turned toward the young officer sitting in the back. Officer Blake, you wrote this ticket. Would you come forward again? Blake stood, visibly uneasy. Yes, Your Honor. After hearing Mr. Hayes's story, do you still believe he broke the law in spirit? The officer swallowed hard. In spirit? No, sir. He broke the limit, not the law. Robert turned slightly, offering the officer a faint smile. Don't worry, son. It's your job to stop people. Mine was to keep moving. A few people laughed softly, then fell quiet again. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Hayes, I need to ask you something difficult. Why are you still doing this alone? There must be someone. Family? Neighbors? The VA? Robert's face clouded. The VA sends forms. My neighbors send prayers. But prayers don't drive cars. I promised my wife I'd look after him myself. She made me promise twice. Once when he enlisted, and once when she knew she was dying. Caprio hesitated, then said gently, She must have been an extraordinary woman. Robert's voice cracked for the first time. She was the kind of woman who could make a man believe there's something worth living for after war. A long pause filled the air. Then the judge said softly, And now you carry that promise alone. Robert nodded, straightening his back. Until I can't. At that moment, the courtroom door opened quietly. A clerk hurried in, whispering something to the bailiff, who approached the bench and handed the judge a folded note. Caprio read it, then looked up with an expression no one could read. "Mr. Hayes," he said slowly, "the hospital just called. Your son has taken a turn. They're asking for you." The old man didn't move for a few seconds. Then he simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." Caprio's voice caught. "Go. This can wait." Robert placed his hand on the table, steadying himself as he stood. "With respect, Judge, I'll finish what I started. A man shouldn't leave the field before the final call." The judge rose from his seat. "Then consider this my order. Case adjourned until further notice. Go to your son. That's the only place justice needs you now." Robert gave a small salute. "Permission granted, sir?" Caprio smiled through the heaviness. "Always." As the old man turned to leave, the judge called after him, "Mr. Hayes, when you see him, tell him his father taught this courtroom something today." Robert paused at the doorway, eyes glistening. "And what's that, Judge?" "That sometimes mercy is stronger than any law I've ever read." Robert nodded once. "Then you understand what soldiers die for." He stepped into the hallway, the echo of his cane fading like a heartbeat. Back inside, the courtroom stayed utterly still. Judge Caprio stared at the empty space where the veteran had stood and whispered to himself, "If all crimes looked like love, my bench would be empty." When the hearing resumed 2 days later, the bench felt colder. The space Robert Hayes usually filled with quiet dignity was now an empty chair and a folded newspaper with his name on it. The courtroom seemed to breathe slower, as if waiting for footsteps that didn't come. Then, just as Judge Caprio was about to begin, the door creaked open. Robert entered. The same jacket, the same worn shoes, but his walk was heavier. A man carrying something invisible and far too heavy. Caprio stood instinctively. "Mr. Hayes, I didn't think you'd make it today." Robert gave a faint nod. "Neither did I, Your Honor. But a promise is a promise." He sat slowly, folding his cap in his lap. The judge studied him for a long moment before speaking. "How's your son?" Robert's answer was quiet, but steady. "He's gone, sir. Yesterday morning." A ripple of silence moved through the room. Even the court reporter stopped typing. "I was there," Robert continued. "He squeezed my hand once before he went. I told him I was proud of him, and he tried to smile. I like to think he heard me." The judge's voice softened. "Mr. Hayes, I am deeply sorry for your loss." Robert shook his head. "No need to be sorry, Judge. He's finally at peace. I'm the one who's got to learn how to drive without a destination." Caprio exhaled slowly. "You've been through more than most men ever could, and yet you came here today." Robert looked up. "I came because I said I would. My wife used to say, 'Finish what you start, Rob, even grief.' So here I am." The judge nodded, visibly moved. "You remind me of something my father used to say. Character isn't built by what you win, but by what you endure quietly." Robert smiled faintly. "Your father sounds like someone who's known loss, too." For a while, neither spoke. Then the judge opened a brown envelope on the bench. "Mr. Hayes, before today's session, I received a letter from the hospital staff. They wanted me to know that your son's final words were, 'Tell Dad to go easy on himself.'" The old man froze, then closed his eyes. "That sounds like him, always trying to take care of me, even at the end." Caprio continued softly, "They said you stayed with him all night, reading out loud until sunrise." Robert nodded. "I read him his favorite book, The Old Man and the Sea. He always said it reminded him of me. Guess he wasn't wrong. Both of us chasing something that keeps slipping away." The judge leaned forward. "And did you finish it?" Robert smiled through tears. Of course. You don't stop halfway through Hemingway. The courtroom filled with a fragile kind of stillness. Not sorrow, but reverence. Mr. Hayes, Caprio said quietly, after what you've been through, this ticket means nothing. You owe no one an apology. But Robert shook his head. Respectfully, Your Honor, I disagree. The law can't pick who it forgives. If I broke the rule, I'll pay. That's how the world stays upright. Caprio studied him, then said, You believe justice and mercy can't share the same bench? Robert thought for a long moment. No, sir. I think mercy's the reason justice doesn't break. A murmur spread through the audience, soft, emotional, like the rustle of leaves in wind. The judge stood. You've already paid, Mr. Hayes. Every day since that drive, you've shown more humanity than most laws ever demand. But if it brings you peace, I'll record this fine as fulfilled in service. Robert rose carefully, leaning on his cane. That sounds fair, Judge. My wife would have liked that phrase. Fulfilled in service. She always said, love's just another word for duty. Caprio's voice grew husky. And you've honored both. Robert reached into his pocket, took out the photograph of his son, and placed it on the judge's desk. I'd like to leave this here, if that's all right. Not as evidence, as a reminder. Caprio nodded, eyes shining. It will stay right here, Mr. Hayes. The veteran adjusted his jacket, preparing to leave. Thank you, Judge, for listening, for seeing more than a ticket. As he reached the door, the judge called softly, Mr. Hayes, what will you do now? Robert paused. Same thing I've always done, sir. Wake up, salute the day, and drive toward what's left of it. And then he was gone. The judge looked at the photograph on his desk, two soldiers smiling in the sunlight, and whispered to himself, Some men fight wars. Others keep peace alive just by remembering. The following week, the courtroom filled before dawn. No one wanted to miss what they knew would be more than a ruling. It would be a farewell. Reporters lined the back wall, but even they stayed quiet, as if speaking too loudly would break the fragile air that hung over the room. Judge Caprio entered slowly, carrying a single frame in his hands, the photograph Robert Hayes had left behind. He placed it on the bench before speaking. This isn't evidence, he said. It's a reminder of what the law sometimes forgets, that behind every case file is a heartbeat. Then the doors opened, and Robert walked in. The room rose as one. He moved carefully, leaning harder on his cane than before, but still refused help. He nodded to the judge, to the officer who once wrote his ticket, even to the crowd. His dignity filled the room more completely than any sound could. Mr. Hayes, Caprio began softly, I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Robert smiled faintly. Well, Your Honor, I couldn't let a good story end halfway. The judge chuckled. You've become something of a legend, you know. The veteran who sped toward love. Robert shrugged. I was just late for my promise. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the courtroom. Caprio stood, adjusting his glasses. I've been a judge for decades. I've heard thousands of excuses, most made of noise, some made of fear. But yours was made of devotion. And devotion doesn't belong in the category of crimes. He looked down at the papers before him, then folded them neatly and set them aside. Therefore, I dismiss this citation entirely. But I'm issuing you a new kind of sentence, Mr. Hayes, one this court has never given. Robert raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerous, Judge. Not dangerous, Caprio said with a smile. Important. I want you to come here once a week and speak to young drivers, not about speeding, but about what it means to have purpose. You've lived it. They need to hear it. For the first time, Robert looked genuinely moved. You want me to teach them about purpose? Yes, said Caprio, because the world is full of people driving fast toward nothing. You remind us what it looks like to drive for someone. Robert's voice trembled slightly. Then I'll accept, Your Honor. But only on one condition. What's that? That I get to tell them my son's name before every talk. Caprio nodded. You have my word. The audience broke into soft applause. A few veterans in the back stood at attention. The young officer who'd stopped Robert wiped his eyes and muttered, That's the kind of law I want to serve under. The judge smiled at him. Then you already are. Robert turned to leave, but the judge stopped him one last time. Mr. Hayes, before you go, may I ask, what keeps you standing after everything you've lost? The old man looked around the room, the crowd, the light pouring through the windows, the photograph of his son on the desk, and said quietly, Because love never retires, Judge. It just finds new orders to follow. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the judge spoke, voice thick but steady. Then let this be your final order, to keep following it. Robert saluted him, firm and precise. Understood, sir. As he left, the entire room stood again. Caprio remained frozen behind the bench, the weight of silence pressing on his chest. Then he picked up the photograph and looked at it for a long time before speaking the final words that would echo across the country. In this court, we don't measure guilt by mistakes, but by the love that outlives them. Justice without mercy is just punishment, but mercy with truth, that's humanity. A week later, the court released the video. Millions watched as an old veteran saluted. A judge blinked away tears, and the audience rose to their feet. Comments flooded in. This is what justice should sound like. And somewhere in Rhode Island, on a quiet road by the ocean, a faded Buick could be seen driving slowly into the sunrise. One man keeping his final promise, not to the law, but to love itself.